Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending on where you are on this fast-forward planet, which I'm sad to report is still wrapped in a pandemic. There's way too much vaccine euphoria in the United States, I think now. We've had great progress here under the new administration, but the world still has about 6 billion people who have not seen one shot, let alone two. And that means, as you can see in India right now, there's terrible consequences. They had the biggest day spike, 300,000 plus new cases in a day, even topping the United States at the peak of our pandemic tragedy this past year. But today we're talking about Earth Day for obvious reasons. It's the 51st version. And we're going to focus a little bit on some of the efforts to co-opt and market around that, and also about the flip side. How do you make the most of the vision of Earth Day that was there at the very beginning in the face of some of this kind of disinformation? What you're looking at now is an ad, sort of. This is the winner in the new climate comedy, University of Colorado Boulder, Inside the Greenhouse Project climate comedy competition yesterday. We're going to get to that in a second because I have to set it up so you can hear it. And I'm going to introduce my guests, Maggie Koerth Baker from 538.com, great science writer and sometimes singer. I won't force you today.
Please don't.
Who covers all kinds of issues related to this moment on Earth that humanity faces with our growing pains. We have John Morales, a great meteorologist and climate expert in Miami, a longtime TV journalist there and an evangelist for climate communication among meteorologists, which is such a vital frontier, because if we don't have meteorologists, they're trusted, despite the fact that meteorology has still got errors in it, which is implicit in how you forecast weather. They're very highly trusted. They're in everybody's living room or on their device every day. And so it's great to see that work that you're doing, John. Buenos dias. Great to have you here. Adam Sobel, who's at the Columbia Climate School, newly minted, Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, the biggest, one of the world's biggest, if not the biggest, center for climate science, probing the details of how we're changing this planetary system and the ocean system that's so related to it. And Tia Nelson in Wisconsin, who is the climate director for the Outrider Foundation. I love the name of the Outrider Foundation, and is perhaps known best for her roots in environmentalism, going back to her father's day 51 years ago, Senator Gaylord Nelson, and founding this Earth Day moment, this concept, I don't know if you call it a holiday or just a special day, but here we are in this moment together. Let me just get back to that video because it's worth showing. I just have to do the right thing or you won't hear it. And then we'll get on with the show. So here we go. Exxon.
Holidays from all of us at the ExxonMobil executive team. In these trying times, it's important to remember what matters most this time of year, keeping our stock prices as high as possible. Our science elves are hard at work researching new technologies like algae biofuels, which we'll be sure to mention in all of our ad campaigns. Great work from the Greenwashing team. But don't worry, that's only about 1% of our budget. And as of 2021, we'll be cutting the carbon capture department altogether. The rest is all oil and gas. You know, the good stuff. This holiday season, we're continuing our tradition of spreading more than just holiday cheer. We're spreading mass disinformation.
So there you go. And what's kind of weird is, of course, when you look around the internets or in your social feed, even right now, you'll see stuff that's not that dissimilar from that parody. And I think that's driven a couple of our guests a little bit crazy. So we're going to talk about the downside of all this first. And maybe we'll start with John. John and Adam both have written pieces for the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, describing some of their feelings and thoughts about where we go from here with sort of the co-optation of this concept. Adam, what's your... I will start with John. I'm sorry, down in Miami Beach. In the city of Miami.
Yeah, well, I mean, so we're bombarded here by ads, which may not necessarily be linked directly to Earth Day. It's not an Earth Day campaign, but the example that I gave in the column I wrote for the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists is about Florida Power and Light. And you really ought to, if you can link later the article so you can see the YouTube version of this commercial, which airs in some of the major media markets here in Florida. Because it's cinematic. I mean, there you go. That's a screen grab of it. So this 12, 13-year-old girl is, confidently walking towards me as a former oil-burning power plant is blown up behind her, right? And then, of course, she tells me as the commercial runs how they're switching to clean, natural American gas, right? Or clean American natural gas. And then they go on in the commercial to talk about green hydrogen and how you just take some water and sunshine and you've got energy. And yes, NextEra, the parent company of Florida Power and Light, indeed has a pilot project for green hydrogen underway. But the problem is that just like in that parody of ExxonMobil that we just watched, whatever power comes from that green hydrogen would be a minuscule percentage of the entire energy portfolio, which is mainly natural gas, mainly gas. See, they've gotten to me.
Right. How long is the history of the term natural gas as opposed to gas?
And we can talk about that, right? I mean, that's greenwashing as well. The term natural gas. So it's really a fascinating thing. I use it as an example, and I state in my column today that Florida Power and Light is just one of many, many examples where they're overselling us on these, environmental initiatives, which in reality are a deflection from many of their polluting ways. And we can talk about deflection too. I think it's a hot topic now with Michael Mann's book, The New Climate War, where he talks quite a bit about that corporate deflection that we've been seeing.
Right. And Adam, how would you summarize your take-back approach? Here's a tweet with your piece.
Yeah. Right. So the Bulletin asked me to write something in response to this greenwashing. A few people had written things already about these greenwashing ads, and they asked me to write something about it. And I don't think I have anything new to say about the greenwashing per se. I mean, John's articulated, and you have, and many other people have, and I don't. But what I wanted to think about was why, to me, and I think to a lot of people that I know who work in climate or environmental issues, Earth Day just doesn't bring a lot of joy somehow, even though you would think it would. And we all believe in what it should stand for, but somehow it just feels like, oh, here we are again. Everybody's racing to do something, and you're getting all kinds of, there's all kinds of events, but somehow they don't. To me, they don't. A lot of it doesn't seem to connect with what we might think should be or what historically were the core messages of it. So I was just kind of meditating on that, and I think, there was one of the pieces you linked to, Andy. I think it was by Emily Atkin, talked about the early roots of Earth Day and how it was a social justice, was conceived as a social justice thing. But I think it's sort of lost that a little bit in how it's perceived, and it becomes one of these things where, I mean, one thing you could say is, well, it focuses, by focusing us on one day, it makes us not think about, we should be thinking about the Earth all the time. And that's true, but you could say that about any day that marks any cause. Sure. So I don't really think that's but it's more just that I like it's become somehow, even though it has a great history, the early environment movement inspired the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act and all these great successes, but it's sort of somehow, in my perception, I think a lot of people's perception, it somehow lost that. And whereas the climate movement now suddenly has new energy and a new power coming from the youth activists and that have recognized it as a social justice issue, an issue that connects to racial and economic justice and the rights of non-human species, that it really has that meaning, and that there is some conflict associated with that. Somehow Earth Day has acquired this more anodyne image of, sort of white people feeling good about recycling or something. And that's not to say that that's the meaning inherent to it. It's just sort of what it feels like. So I don't know. I was just allowing myself to vent that crankiness a bit, and I, and to say that maybe we should try to find the roots of it again somehow. And maybe some people have never lost it, but what I learned, I made this slight effort to see whether it was just me. And I talked to a few other people I know who work in this space, and I found that my feelings were not my own alone.
Yeah, well, I want to talk to Maggie about the journalism embedded in the larger news flow and ad flow around these things in a second. But we're talking here about the roots. So let's start with Tia. Let's go back to the roots with Tia. And Tia, I know you feel really strongly about various aspects of this. Last year was the 50th anniversary, and we were on an event together. And so when you think about Earth Day in this current context with Biden in office and still the challenges being so enormous, coming out of a pandemic, sort of, what's your rallying cry right now?
Well, it's interesting, Adam. I appreciate you pointing out, because many people miss that my father's original call to action was multi-generational, it was bipartisan, and there was a very strong social justice call to action. I would pretty strenuously disagree with the notion that social justice call to action was actually embraced by the environmental community when my father made it. It has been years before that actually happened. He said on the eve of the first Earth Day, ecology is a big science, not a narrow science. It's the worst environments in America, in the inner cities and in Appalachia. It is rats in the ghetto and public housing unworthy of its name. There is no evidence that I've found that the environmental community embraced that message in the 10 years that followed, the so-called environmental decade, where more environmental laws were passed than any time in American history. And a Republican president created the Environmental Protection Agency, and the Clean Air Act passed with one single no vote. What happened in 1980? My father was defeated in the United States Senate, and Ronald Reagan was elected president, and was making Washington government intervention over corporations a public enemy in essence. So I think it's incredible and incredibly important that the youth climate movement today sees the intersectionality of all of these issues. But to suggest that social justice call to action, that people actually responded to it when my father made that CTA, I've seen no evidence of it. And the environmental community is very late to come to the table on that. For me, I joked with Andy, I guess I put it in the email, too. The most important thing I'm going to do today is not be here with you guys, but right after this call into the fourth grade class at the elementary school in the town my father was born, and tell them that my dad was a little boy just like them, a little boy from a little town with a really big dream. That dream came true beyond his wildest imagination. Help them find their voice, give them a sense of agency, let them know that unimaginable things happen from single acts of principle. Certainly my dad could not have known the outcome of the first Earth Day. 20 million people gathering, the largest event in American history, any more than Rosa Parks could have known that the simple act of defiance of saying no when being told to move the back of the bus in 1964 would move forward the civil rights movement in the manner it did. That was an unimaginable outcome, just as it would be for Greta Thunberg in her solo act of protest in front of the Swedish parliament. And so the critical element of the success of the first Earth Day was, my father was a great orator and a great leader, and really cultivated friendships across the aisle. But he couldn't have imagined the outcome of it. And the fact that it is, you made an important point. of course, Earth Day should be every day, just like Martin Luther King Day should be every day, right? But these become touchstones and reminders of an important value. And, you know, just one last thing on the Beautify America ad is very interesting to me. And I think we should be really cautious here in recognizing what was happening 50 years ago. And Lyndon Baden, what was Mrs. Johnson's name, Andy?
Oh, right.
Lady Bird.
Johnson
Lady Bird.
launched the Beautify America campaign because it was a social norm to throw your trash out the window, right? I'm a big fan of the show Mad Men. You might remember Mr. Draper and his perfectly coiffed wife, and this beautiful little picnic with their children in this beautiful park. And when they get up to leave, they just pick up the blanket in which they've had their picnic, lift it up, and the trash goes about. That actually was a social norm. And so there's a difference between that and what Coca-Cola is doing today, like right now, running these ads about their fabulous new single-use plastic bottles, which somehow miraculously are better than the single-use plastic bottles that aren't getting recycled that they've been manufacturing for so long. So I think the historical context is important to keep in mind in that manner.
Some very powerful points there. So Maggie, you know, as a journalist looking at this landscape, where we try to fit the news into this bigger landscape of messaging, does that feel like hitting your head with a hammer every morning, or what? You know, how do you what do you think about on a day like today?
Well, so I have honestly, as a journalist, I've honestly stopped really doing much that's a Earth Day tie-in, because there's a lot of ways that it doesn't really seem like Earth Day itself is a productive movement, that there's a lot of awareness building and a lot of let's go clean trash up in the neighborhood kind of thing. And in some ways, I kind of want to poke at the idea that in some ways that's its own kind of greenwashing. That when we are focused on these 101 little things that you can do to save the earth, when we're focused on these individual responsibility action kind of things, we're missing this big picture. And the real Earth Day crisis of climate change is this big picture, top down problem that, you know, it's great to teach my kids to recycle, but what good exactly is that doing if the entire plastics recycling industry is built on a lie? Which is something that we've sort of figured out over the past couple of years. I mean, I have been doing reporting on the way that plastics have just been getting shipped to China, shipped to Indonesia, and burned for 15, 20 years, that we've been telling people that plastics recycling is a viable industry. And China shutting that process down has been wildly detrimental to the entire recycling industry in the US, because now there's nowhere for it to go, because there was never a market for it in the first place. So I think that one of the things that Earth Day does for me at this point is sort of throw into stark relief the gap between what individuals can accomplish and what is going on that large systemic problem scale, and where those pushes should maybe be. If you want to really do something on Earth Day, we should be pushing on those big systemic issues and not necessarily focusing on individual choices. I mean, I think another thing that has really thrown me off over the years is just the amount that, God, every year my email inbox fills up with Earth Day is a shopping holiday promotional stuff.
Yeah.
Have you guys bought your Earth Day gifts for your friends and family yet? Because you're running out of time. And the entire, which is entirely antithetical to the entire point of what if we just use less?
Right.
Like, you can't have a consumer shopping holiday and an actual Earth Day at the same time.
This is an interesting point you're making. To me, some of the promise I see in today's communication landscape is there are people like this guy, Raleigh Williams, who just got an MFA, a MS, Master's in Science degree in Columbia in Sustainable Development. He's a comedian. He was one of the winners of that climate comedy process, and he just created one of his recent videos. It's gotten hundreds of thousands of views. Was on what you think are those recycling marks on the plastic containers. To sort them are really not about that. They're about other realities of and where the stuff goes. As you can see here in his video, is a travesty. So it's kind of, there's a potential, I think, maybe to flip the script. Although, and Tia, I don't know if you have any quick thoughts before we get back to, I know you're going to have to go soon to get back to John.
Well, Noon, just, one, I really appreciate your points, Maggie. And I it's interesting to me that President Biden picked today to indicate the U.S.'s reentry and reassertion of global leadership on climate change, and I certainly celebrated that. And Joe and my father and my mother were close, but I have no answer for this question, but it flummoxes me, and I think the point. It is really important that we don't allow corporations to shift the responsibility to clean up onto individual action. But that doesn't mean individual action doesn't matter. It does establish social norms. Living our values matters. But you in mentioning the plastics being shipped to China and being burned, just after that, you talked about, I've not seen, buy something on, buy your friend an Earth Day gift. That is ironic in so many ways. But it, to a certain degree, it contradict isn't the right word, and I mean no offense in this, but the fact is, we, especially those of us in the first world in the United States, we buy a lot of shit, and it has a really big impact, right? Mm-hmm. And those so on the one hand, we're saying you shouldn't buy stuff on Earth Day. That's antithetical to the message of Earth Day. And on the other hand, we're saying, individual action is insufficient. We all know it's insufficient. Is shifting the burden and the blame. And so I think, isn't the question then how to hold corporations accountable? How to insist on leadership in Washington and the state houses and the county boards and the town councils. And that's where individual action matters a lot. That's why Earth Day was successful. Not because my dad he stood up and gave a really great speech. It's because 20 million people showed up in the streets. And so this idea of accountability is a really important one. And there's, some challenges that I don't know how to wrestle with around this idea that, we as consumers, I had this, pretty vigorous debate with an unnamed person of a lot of wealth who wanted to focus. Andy will know what I'm talking about on population, and I remember Andy saying, well, the world can handle 8 billion or 10, vegan monks, but it can't handle 8 billion of people.
Las Vegas.
Yeah.
Right.
So, it's complicated, and when it gets complicated, it's hard to fashion your messages so that they resonate and precipitate actions and understanding that you want.
Yeah, no, I mean, I absolutely agree that it's not that individual choices are irrelevant. Individual choices are absolutely sort of, how we send signals. But what I get hung up on is the way that the institutions that are actually in charge of these systems that enable people to make choices without hurting themselves, you can it's one thing to sort of tell people like, hey, drive less. But if you live in a city where that is impossible without basically like shooting yourself in the foot every single day, you know, there's a good chunk of America does not have good public transportation. A good chunk of America, most of America, does not have good public transportation. And that's not a thing that we can change just by biking more often. That's a thing that we change by holding governments and corporations accountable. And that's something that I think that there needs to be more emphasis on at this point. And the problem with Earth Day to me is that it has shifted, or maybe it hasn't shifted, maybe it just was always there. In my mind, it has shifted to being more about like these individual choices that you can make, like let's bike today, and less about how do we change our entire city infrastructure to accommodate people not having to get in a car.
It is a wicked problem in the sense that, I mean, climate change, I've talked about it over and over again after 35 years of reporting, is it's an and plus problem. And this, you know, there are a lot of debates about personal action versus power. Power is where it really does matter. But Washington, in the end, is a system that can be affected by communities of people. You know, people. Social media, I think, has given people a little more of an even landscape of counter messaging and building community around problems. Actually, in Miami and South Florida, I know Dan Kahane, a guy at Yale who works on cultural division and cognition, had worked down there with communities where there's a lot of agreement on sea level rise, on ways to shape communities differently, that crosses some of these seem like very brittle boundaries. So it feels like people can make a difference. Although, as you say, absolutely, if you look at going to zero, stopping the rise of CO2 in the atmosphere is a profound action that's going to require coordinated, deep investments that only come through commitments at the highest level, too. So, John, I just wanted to get a brief sort of some input from South Florida on when you see the landscape of people, the landscape of messaging. You're at a network, you know, how does that play out?
Well, it is actually a very interesting day in Florida regarding what you're saying, because I think people here in South Florida especially are very much aware that we are ground zero for one of the biggest symptoms of the warming climate, which is accelerating sea level rise. You know, the number of sunny day flooding events has increased 400% over the span of the last 20 years. And, you know, we're seeing this particularly when we get the spring tides or king tides that basically inundate many of our streets with salt water, you know, even on a sunny day. So people are very much aware of it. There is strong local government efforts now from local municipalities and counties to plan sustainably, including changing the way that new buildings, new structures will be built to make sure that they are more sustainable, retrofitting old ones. You know, yes, more. Well, the public transportation here is a mess, but some improvement in that area, some improvement in cycling, etc. But here's what's special about today. The Florida legislature is in session, and they've got two bills being debated today, possibly voted on today, that are preemption bills. These are bills that are going to keep the local municipalities and counties from being able to enact these new ordinances that would make us more sustainable going forward. So, you know, you look at some of these bills, which are actually drafted by special interest groups. You know, think of, right now I can't remember the name of the industry association for gas, for example, but there is, sorry, the phone there.
That's okay.
There is an effort right now they're in legislator to keep us from being able to act that way, because it's going to weaken all our ability to be able to regulate all those sustainable efforts. So it's an interesting state to live in. We've got these, as you very well classify them, wicked problems going on down here, but there's been a lot of historical resistance to climate mitigation and adaptation, particularly in the previous administration from now Senator Rick Scott, formerly governor of Florida. You might recall that climate change was not a phrase that you could utter if you were working with the Rick Scott administration. Now Ron DeSantis is his heir. And while Ron DeSantis pivoted to environment in the wake of a big red tide and a toxic algae bloom outbreak in 2018, and that helped him win the election by about 30,000 votes. This is a state with 22 million people. He won by 30,000 votes. I think he won because he pivoted to environment. And while he's doing some things, particularly when Trump was in power, to get funds down here for Everglades restoration, overall, I would say that his environmental grade, which was horrific when he was a congressman, remains pretty low. It's got to be in the D- range, maybe up from an F when he was a congressman. So we're swimming upstream. That's the bottom line of what's going on. And there's a lot of awareness, a lot of concern. Local politicians want action, but the state is preventing it.
Interesting. Well, we'll watch that legislation today. Adam, you're part of the community at Columbia that's focused on, there's a big meeting coming up in June on managed retreat, meaning normalizing the idea that communities as we knew them in the 20th century, many can adapt to a certain extent, but change is inevitable. We have to, sea level rise is not political. And I think that one of the things about the climate crisis, climate change, and maybe Earth Day, maybe one of the issues with Earth Day is that it's a slogan as opposed to a set of actions. The thing that I found also after all this time looking at climate change is that as soon as you split it into its pieces, boosting resilience, cutting risk for communities at risk, changing energy systems to clean ones, each one of those has action points that are less political, less about throwing slogans at each other. And I don't know whether you've experienced that in the work you're doing.
I mean, yeah, I don't know. I mean, as scientists, of course, we often like to think that our work is not political. Some of us are introverts who were drawn to this kind of work because the rough and tumble of politics was hard for us, and we thought we could contribute to society by, doing some technical thing that. And I think some of us, I certainly include myself in this, have learned over the years that that's not really true. That if we want our work to really contribute, we have to engage the political dimension in some way, or at least be cognizant of it. I don't know if I'm really answering your question, Andy, but I think what we're talking about here in a conversation about Earth Day is that these problems, I think they are political. I mean, I don't think there's much that isn't. I mean, you would think, for example, John was talking about solar power in Florida. You would think that putting up solar panels in Florida would be an apolitical thing. Like, who loses from that? Well, apparently it's totally political because the power companies don't want to do it. And the only thing that's going to change them is mass action of some kind of coercion. And that has to be political. So I think, the issue is that, Tia articulated very well how the original idea from her father was a social justice movement, but she said, I think quite rightly, the environmental movement didn't pick that up. And that's why, for example, in media, if you read the newspaper, I'm sure you're aware of this, Andy, you wrote environmental columns for the New York Times for many, many years, right? That was like, I read it back when I was a kid, that was in like there was a science section of the paper, so the climate news was quarantined to this niche thing that nerds like me read. I mean, I'm not denigrating your audience. I was part of it, you know. But it's reached the point now. What's changed now is that everybody understands that it's political, and now it's on the front page of the New York Times. You know, the Sunrise Movement helped get Joe Biden elected, and they've pushed him to where his positions are, and that's all great. I think the problem with Earth Day is that it somehow doesn't capture that. And maybe part of it is the name of it. You know, that Earth sounds so generic. I mean, nobody's going to say they're anti-Earth, but somehow it encourages us to think that these things are not political when we all now know that they are. And so that's that. I think that's the disconnect. I don't know if I answered your question at all, but I think managed retreat is
changing everything about our lifestyles day is less fuzzy and warm, huh?
Well, yeah. But I think it's not, as you said, Maggie, it's not just changing our lifestyles, because that's the, you know, plant trees in the neighborhood. And by the way, I mean, I do know people who work for agencies that organize events planting trees in the neighborhood, and a lot of them don't like Earth Day either, because it diminishes their attendance the rest of the year, and you know, and often this time of the year may not be the best time to plant the trees. Actually, I mean, maybe you should plant them in the. I don't know. That's but anyway, I mean, I think that you know, the individual actions. You know, I agree with everything everybody said. I mean, individual actions are important, sometimes in their own right, but also because they're part of the culture. And if everybody talks about the individual actions, maybe that'll help collective action. But somehow the important action is collective, is the taking to the streets and the voting and all that. And Earth Day somehow has become detached from that. That's just the feeling a lot of us have.
Yeah, I'd love to turn to Tia and then Maggie, and we're coming into that sort of solutions part of the chat, the last 10 minutes or so, 15 minutes here. But Tia, I just want to show one thing here, which John Sutter, a great CNN videographer who's now doing a different project on time and climate. In 2015, he did one of the most valuable pieces of journalism I've ever seen on this, where he went to Woodward County, Oklahoma. It's the most skeptical county in America on global warming in 2015, just ahead of the Trump election. And he just did stand-up interviews with people. And this guy, who's an evangelical Christian who works for an oil company, he's like talking, at one point he says, you know, God controls the environment. So you're thinking as a progressive like me, oh my God. But then the latter half of the interview, he goes, you know, we're going to try to have a solar system big enough to supply all the needs of our house. And I guarantee you that fall, or in 2016, he did not vote for Hillary. And I would assume he did not vote for Biden. But here, this gets to Dan Kahane's work. And when you think about the politics, it's like, how do you frame the question can really frame the politics to a certain extent. This guy, if you go into Woodward County, Oklahoma with a banner saying solve the climate crisis, he's not your friend. If you go in saying, hey, why do you have solar panels on your roof? He's like, oh man, I love getting off the grid. I'm an independent kind of libertarian guy. I'd like to, you know, why should I pay a check to a goddamn utility? So it's like, it's there but we all have these frames and narratives, and sometimes they get in the way. I mean, Maggie, as a journalist, you know about framing, and Tia too, as a campaigner who's been in the states that are mixed and communities that are mixed, you know about this too. So maybe where do we go from here? You know, and is there a way to have an Earth Day or an Earth Year or an Earth Century that has different characteristics?
I was just going to say to Adam, you know, I don't know whether we should be counting our blessings or not, but my father did not propose the name Earth Day. It came from a New York Times, a New York ad man. My father's proposal was Environmental Teach-In Day, and people really
how interesting. I didn't know
that was called to action in his speech, because it was based on the anti-war teach-in. So he called it Environmental Teach-In Day. I don't know whether that's good or bad. And I will need a short break before I join the kids, but I thought I would share with you a very quick quote if you have the time, Andy. So I knew my father had said something about this greenwashing thing a while back, and so and he had a marvelous sense of humor. This works much better when he's saying it. I don't have a video of it. I found it in writing. He said, greenwashing is not all bad. In fact, I could argue it's generally a positive development. It shows that even the bad guys want to look green on the environment. And it's and he went on to say something, because, people are expecting that of them. He said, it's a true public relations success when your enemies claim to share your concerns. And, that's not entirely true, nor is that a complete and literal reflection of the way my father felt about it. He was highly critical of industry much of his career. But I think it brings us to the question of, there's a difference between Patagonia and Exxon, right? And they both claim to be engaged in, green activities, and one of them is pioneering, and the other is, hypocritical in the extreme. And so that, the question is, how do you empower people? And I think journalists and scientists are a critical part of this, to call out the bullshit and to look at these claims and to hold corporations accountable. And that's a challenge for journalists and scientists and advocates alike.
Environmental teach-in day. That's my takeaway from today. So we should just, because what that's about is learning and listening. If we can all find ways to do more listening, that feels like a good start too. Well, Tia, I'll let you go to those kids, which seems to be a wonderful opportunity. With the more time we spend with the generation that's inheriting what we're doing, the better.
Convince them they can make a difference, because that's what made a difference in 1970. So I'm grateful to all of you. It was a delight to be a part of the conversation. Always good to see you, Andy, and nice to meet the rest of you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome back anytime. Anytime. Yeah. She's been on a number of the shows already, including some of the music ones. She's not singing, but those are some really important thoughts. Maybe another round of let's get at the solutions question, Maggie, in the context of journalism. How do we solve this problem? Ha ha ha.
Ha 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 ha.
And John too.
I am not. Sorry, had a request for cheddar bunnies happening just off screen. This is something I struggle with, honestly, because I feel like we are in a space where you kind of have, there's not a clear starting point. You have politicians who say that they want to do something about this, but who then say they can't because they don't have enough support from the other politicians who don't want to do things. You have corporations who say that they want to do something about climate change, but then don't because that's antithetical to their entire business. Then you have people who want to do something but can't influence the government or the corporations enough to change things. And I don't really know. Honestly, like as a person, I absolutely flat out refuse to call myself a consumer. That is a giant pet peeve that I have. As a person, I don't know where to start with this. I don't know what the entry point is, because I have spent the last 20 years with, with my government, with politicians that I have voted for, telling me that this is something that they care about and something they're going to do something about. And then what they do is tiny little scrapes that don't actually get at the whole. And with, companies talking up their history and like all the good things that they've done, and not actually getting us anywhere either. And I don't really know where it goes from there, because it feels like there's a lot of hot air and there's a lot of, oh, I really care about this, and not a lot of action.
This is true. So John Morales too, you're in the media. I know, but you've also been working really hard to, especially within meteorologists, to spread capacity to bring climate change into the communication landscape. Can you just, is that part of what you would see? Obviously, you work a lot on it, so is that part of the pathway forward?
Yeah, actually, it's interesting. As you know, and I'll be trying to be very brief because it's slightly off topic, but there's an interesting history amongst broadcast meteorologists in terms of acceptance of the state of the science of climate change. So 15, 20 years ago, we had a problem. For whatever reason, both the classically trained meteorologists plus the weathercasters, I'll call them, were not understanding very well how climate models were run, and they saw them as weather models instead of climate models. And because they saw some of the faults in the weather models, they said, well, if a weather model can't, is faulty 5 days out, how can I possibly look at a climate model without understanding that the physics of how these models are built and run are entirely different, and without necessarily understanding that, as you look at hindcasts, as we call them, in other words, what the climate models had forecast 30 years ago of how the weather would be today, not the weather, the climate would be today, how accurate they've been, these climate models. So the American Meteorological Society, and I was very involved in this effort as Commissioner on Professional Affairs for the Society, we started to train the broadcast meteorologists on this matter. We formed a committee called the Station Scientist Committee. And through these training sessions, whether it was short courses or embedded within some of the conferences that we were providing, we started to see a shift. And today, yes, broadcast meteorologists are not only fully understanding of the state of the science of climate change, but there is a growing number of them that are doing what people like Jim Gandy and Mike Nelson and myself have been doing for 15 or 20 years, which is try to communicate as much as possible on the state of the science of climate change. So now you've got a young generation of broadcast meteorologists, people like Alyssa Rafa, she's in the Charlotte market, who have found ways, even in some challenging markets where she worked at, in deep red states, where she was able to talk about climate change to her audience without, resistance from the audience or getting fired. Because this is a concern, actually, amongst broadcast meteorologists in some of the red markets that their bosses are going to think that the station's going to look bad, right? So we've come a long way, is the bottom line, and there are programs like the one produced at Climate Central called Climate Matters, which is a weekly email blast that goes to about 1,000 broadcast meteorologists across the U.S. in the English and Spanish language, that provides context, graphics, and really a turnkey way to present on the changing climate to the audience. There's a good example right there on screen of a Climate Central graphic, a Climate Matters graphic. So I'm proud to be amongst, I guess, some of the first few weathercasters who ever started to communicate on climate change. But I'm most happy to say that there are many more of us today. And because we are trusted amongst the TV viewers, this is just a great conduit to get climate information out there. And by the way, I'll finish with this. Actually, I'll finish with two things. The Yale surveys on the 6 Americas, from the people that are dismissive about climate change to the people that are alarmed about climate change. These are the two extremes, and there's 4 in between. We have seen a significant shift away from the dismissives, and many more people are concerned or even alarmed about climate. And I think broadcast meteorologists have indeed played a role in this. Last thing I wanted to say, I wanted to ask Adam, if you can find it in what you wrote. I just loved something, and I tweeted it last night from your column on this subject, where you're talking about, it's not about celebrating how good it feels to recycle. But I don't want to read it myself. I think you should read it yourself.
Adam, do you have that at hand?
I don't. I have to get it.
Oh, well, I'll do it. Can I do it?
Yeah, please.
I'll do it. So this can serve as a segue to somebody else talking here. But in his column, Adam Sobel wrote, Earth Day is not about celebrating how good it feels to recycle or watch nature documentaries. It is a struggle against powerful opposition to mitigate the catastrophes that are being inflicted for the benefit of the few upon human and non-human alike. So to me, thinking about Earth Day, I think Adam hit the nail on the head. That's what it's all about. And yes, thinking about the solutions to these wicked problems is very difficult. This is a very, very difficult challenge. But this is what we're up against. And I think Adam clearly identified it.
Thank you.
So
very kind.
So again, the pathway, kind of like if you go into Woodward, Oklahoma, the pathway to Earth action might not be to just champion the words Earth Day, but to think about some actionable, what is the power that's impeding action? How do you then get at it in ways that are creative and constructive and can make progress? And John, I think the point you made about climate matters is this all takes time too. 50 years seems like forever. It's 2 generations the way we measure human generations. It's a millisecond of Earth time, if that. It's a microsecond, and there has been change. And if there's change in the newsrooms and meteorologists' newsrooms, then that's a really promising thing. I know there's like hundreds of meteorologists who've been through the climate matters training. It's great that you're translating that work into Spanish with your son, I think you said.
Yeah, he does the
that's
first
great.
pass. He does the first pass, and I finish it up.
And it's great that there are media out there like 538 that put numbers in the foreground, so that creates a landscape in which you can have a reasoned conversation about what is the problem and where do we go from here. So it's great that we've been able to have this session today, fitting in with all the other Earth Day activities and just normal life, as it exists in these pandemic times, which unfortunately are still going to be with us for a long time to come. I'm discouraged to have to report on that, but thanks for being here today. And also thanks to Tia Nelson, who was just such a dynamo and offered some really fresh perspectives and thoughts today. Tia, wherever you are with your in a kid's classroom, have a great day. Thanks for this work in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, and go forth and be well. Hug the people in your bubble. Stay in touch with the ones who are outside of it, and go get on with it. For those who are watching, you can get in touch with me with feedback or questions by looking at that scrolling distracting bar at the bottom. That's my little marketing tool, basically how to have us do more and better stuff. I'm at the Earth Institute now / Columbia Climate School. I'm in the Hudson Valley on Lenape territory and I cherish the landscape they left for us, and hopefully future generations will cherish the landscape that we leave for them. Be well, everybody.